my great pleasure to welcome all of you to tonight's talk. I'd like to thank the Sheppy Dog Fund, which was established by Dr. Alan Klein, for sponsoring this presentation. The Sheppy Dog Fund lectures enable the Flint Institute of the Arts to present speakers addressing the topics of art, religion, and history prior to the 19th century. So it's wonderful to have a donor who is interested in the historic parts of the collections. And I'm going to be speaking to you about collections at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that really focus on the Middle Ages, as you'll see. So all of the art, almost all of the artworks I'll be speaking about this evening come from our collections. But what I hope to do is to provide you with a few things that will kind of open up a broader perspective. So one aspect of the talk will be the history of the collections here in New York, how the Met became such a center for the study and display of medieval art, why it is a department that is divided between two locations. You can see on the screen here the main building at Met Fifth Avenue and the Cloisters, which is in Fort Tryon Park on the very tip of Manhattan. And then I also will focus on a selection of objects that hopefully will open up kind of different ways of thinking about artwork produced in the Middle Ages. And so without further ado, I thought what I would do to get started is actually share an object that has a very personal connection, because it's one instance of an object from the Middle Ages where we actually know a fair amount about the patronage of the object itself, why it was made and who it was made for. And it's a very personal object. It's a book. It's a private prayer book. So I'm going to start out with an illuminated manuscript, in part because this offers, I think, a nice way into the broader topic that we'll be exploring together while we're here. My talk will probably be about 45 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. And I want to thank, before I jump into things, Catherine Scarborough, Heather Wright, and Tracy Glab, who have been my shepherds in this process. So I'm glad that we are here at the event, and thanks all of you for joining. So without further ado, I'm going to share this illuminated manuscript, which comes from the collections of the Cloisters, and is a wonderful devotional object that is a very personal work of art. Today, we tend to think about paintings as being freestanding objects that might hang on a wall. In the Middle Ages, that was certainly the case. There are paintings like murals that were made for monumental decoration of important spaces like churches. But there was also a very significant tradition of book illumination, where these handmade objects, each one of them is unique, often painted on animal skin, referred to as parchment, were filled with decorated initials, marginal illumination, so illuminations around the main picture frame, as you can see here, and then objects that take center stage, which are often narrative in topic. So here we're actually looking at the opening of the section of this prayer book that's devoted to the Psalms. So coming from, in this case, the Old Testament. And as David, King David, was thought to be the author of the Psalms, it opens with an image of David with his harp. And then that episode that is so important in the life of David, drawn from the story of his battle against the giant Goliath, the champion of the Philistines. This is actually a story we'll come back to in a little while. But I wanted to share this object because this actually belonged to a woman whose name we know. This belonged to a member of the French royal family whose name was Bonne of Luxembourg. And her portrait, together with her husband, appears in the manuscript. I'm showing you here a detail, and that is Bonne on the left, behind her husband, kneeling in prayer. So we're looking at Bonne herself represented in her own private prayer book. So this is a luxury object, but something that was really probably the kind of thing that she would have used in her daily devotions. So again, something quite personal and probably even made with her advice and counsel. Bonne of Luxembourg was actually born Judah or Judith. She was the second daughter of John the Blind, who was the king of Bohemia, and his first wife, Elizabeth of Bohemia. And she married into the French royal family. She married the man who would become King John II of France, although she died just before his accession to the throne. So she never actually became queen, but among her children were Charles V of France, Philip II, Duke of Burgundy, and Joan, Queen of Navarre. So She did have a significant impact on the French royal tree. And as I zoom out, the context that you want to imagine here is one of really an elite patron. So here we're looking at a marble sculpture from the Met's medieval collections that was produced around 1350, which is just about the same time this book was made. And it gives you a sense of the dress that a woman like Bonne would have, the costume and the fashion that she would have worn. And the material itself, marble, would have been imported from Italy. So for major commissions of important sculptures, often artists turned to materials that were readily at hand. In the case of France, that was typically limestone. But for very significant commissions, they might import materials from faraway places. In this case, marble, probably imported from Italy to create a series of sculptures for a tomb. We actually don't know the identity of this particular queen, but I'm showing you this image just because it comes from the world that Bonne inhabited and was made, as I said, just around the same time that the book was illuminated. Women could be important patrons and shapers of medieval art and society, and this manuscript illumination is a reminder of that fact. But I'm showing it also because one of the things that I find so exciting about medieval art is that many of the objects that survive were first and foremost functional objects. They were used in rituals like daily prayers, in the case of a prayer book, or to decorate these grand spaces, as you're seeing in this illuminated version of church interiors. Think about stained glass, mosaics, mural paintings, and then obviously the books that were needed to celebrate different kinds of services. Those books could be large institutional books like Bibles that would have belonged to monasteries. They could be choir books that would have been used in communal prayers and divine office, or they would have been service books used on the altar of the church for Christian services. So this is a world where there are multiple forms of works of art that are being produced, but I wanted to start with a book, again, because it kind of brings this down to a very personal level. So in her own book, you're now seeing a broader context of that image that I shared at the very beginning of Bonne kneeling in prayer together with her husband. The two of them, as you can now see, are kneeling in this opening of a section of prayers that are devoted to meditating on Christ's passion. And you can see here, Christ has become animated on the cross. So he's actually engaged in a kind of dialogue with them, where he is pointing down at the wound in his side as they look up and contemplate him. And it's that image that serves as the portal that Bonne would have used as she flipped through the subsequent pages of the book to recite her daily prayers. In this case, focused very much on kind of meditations on the passion of Christ. Here you can see how lavish and time intensive the illuminations are. Think not only about the time it would have taken to produce the materials that are being used for this book. I mentioned that it's animal skin. So a single book like this might require as many as 200 animals. So a tremendous investment of resources to produce a single object in this case. But one other aspect of the artistic production is obviously the energy, the time, and the materials that went into the painting and the illumination, the decoration, if you will, of the book itself. And if you look here, you can see the different stages, and perhaps there are even different specialists who worked on a single page like this. There might have been one artist, probably the master of the workshop, who might have done the figural work, and then specialists who would have worked on illuminated letters, and then someone else perhaps even for that vine scroll background. And if you look very carefully, you'll actually see that those scrolls, that vegetation in red is inhabited by creatures of all different kinds, little rabbits and birds. So there's a tremendous energy and effort that was expended to create something that would hold the attention of a viewer, that would serve as something that you could return to and still discover new things. So it's within that spirit that I hope to really get in and use the format of this talk where we're not in a gallery space, but we're able to really zoom in on images to share some of these kinds of details. Medieval art can also be very strange, abstract, and perhaps even disorienting for modern audiences. This is a subsequent illumination that would have followed in succession after that image of the meditation on the crucifix that we just were looking at. And it singles out for individual contemplation, the different instruments that were used in Christ's Passion, and that very strange shape in the middle that almost looks like the eye of Sauron, if there are any Lord of the Rings fans out there, is actually the wound of Christ. And it was made to the scale of what was believed to be the size of the wound that was opened in his side at the time of the crucifixion. So although it might seem very abstract, there is a kind of devotional reality that is at work here. And it's that sense that I'd like to bring you into as well. So on the one hand, in this talk, I'll be talking about how artists in the Middle Ages reinterpreted the natural world and looked very carefully at some of the things that were readily available around them in their own world, but also used abstract signs and symbols to invoke a different way of thinking about the devotional reality of an experience. So here, the idea is to put the wound of Christ front and center so that you can really concentrate on the suffering that he went through on the cross on behalf of Christians who are faithful to and thinking about the passion that he went through on behalf of Christians. So here in this image, one of the things that's odd about it, perhaps to our eyes, is the kind of abstraction, the way of isolating these single instruments, the column, the crucifix, the sponge, the lance, and then this very bizarre image of the floating wound. But one of the reasons for that was to kind of bring you into a very intense emotional relationship with an event from sacred history. So on the one hand, naturalism might be more in the vein of what we're accustomed to, where there's a description of the world that's recognizable. Or on the other hand, it might be to make a real strong move and a pull on things like human emotion, to think about, in this case, the suffering that Christ experienced on the cross. Now, I'm going to share with you this single opening, which is probably the most reproduced image from the book. And here you get back into the kind of open format of the book. One of the things I didn't mention is that this book is really small enough to easily cradle in the palms of your open hands. So that level of detail that you're seeing is really that much more remarkable when you think about the scale of the book. For those of you that are looking at this on a laptop, it's really, you're looking at the book almost to scale as to what it is in the flesh. And here you're looking at an image of an episode that's described as the three living encountering the three dead. You have these three young noble people out on a hunt on the scene on the left-hand side of the opening. And they have stopped in their tracks because they have encountered these three corpses in different stages of decay who are reaching across and speaking to them across the gutter of the open book, essentially saying, "What I am now, you soon shall be." So the idea here is to meditate on the proximity of death and to be that much more focused on your devotions because you don't know when death might strike. And this is an object that becomes much more poignant when you think about the context within which this book was produced, which was right on the cusp of the epidemic that's now known as the Black Death in 1348. A epidemic descended upon Europe and was responsible for decimating the population in places like Italy. Think about cities like Siena, places like Paris, London. Many of them lost between 1 to 2/3 of their population in a course of months. And although maybe 8 months ago, something like this might have felt far away and hard to imagine, obviously now in the present situation that we're all in, things like this are much closer at hand. But this is an imagery that developed before the Black Death. And I show you this in part just as a reminder of how people in this time period lived in a very different relationship to death than we do now. It was much closer at hand, and it could affect people who were nobles and elite like Bonne of Luxembourg, and obviously had a much more damaging effect when it came to epidemic on populations that were less protected. But one of the reasons I wanted to share this is because Bonne herself actually succumbed to the plague in 1348. And that's the reason that she actually never ascended to the queenship that she would have moved into had she survived the plague. So it's quite a poignant reminder that although we have this book and she owned and used it for a period of time, it was probably only about a year after the book was produced that she died, and her I'm showing you here a kind of general image of a funerary scene. But you can imagine that this book would have passed on into the French royal family and actually became part of the collections of Jean-Duc de Berry, a famous bibliophile of the early 15th century, who was the brother of the man that would become Charles V, the King of France. So there you have Bonne of Luxembourg and the image of a funeral, just as a reminder of how these objects were owned by people. Some of the time we know exactly who owned them, but nevertheless, they were all commissioned, brought into being for particular reasons and served particular functions within medieval society. So with that one reminder of the personal nature of many objects that are now in institutional collections, I'm going to step back and frame a somewhat larger story about the medieval collections here in New York. So I hope you have something nice to drink and you're settling back for a little bit of armchair travel, and that you can visit the New York collections of medieval art at Met Fifth Avenue and at the Cloisters. I'm going to start here, the story at the beginning, really. In a way, it's appropriate to do this in 2020, because the Met, despite the challenges of the last year, is actually in the middle of celebrating its 150th anniversary as a museum. When the Met first started in 1870 as an idea, it was really just that, an idea. A group of philanthropists came together in New York and decided that New York, like any other major metropolitan center, should have its own art museum. And at the very beginning, there was actually no collection. Some of the earliest objects in the collection were plaster casts made after famous objects that could be found around the world, things like the Parthenon or Notre Dame in Paris. When the Met first opened in its current location in Central Park, this is the building that you want to imagine. There are sections of this building that still survive within now the sprawling campus that the Met has become. But the central hall that you're looking at on the left is the Hall of Plaster Casts. So when this building opened, this was 1873 now in Central Park, this is what the Met looked like in the early days. And the core collections were largely reproductions, although that would change dramatically and quickly. And that change was due to a large extent to J.P. Morgan, the great financier and philanthropist. Here shown in that image on the left as a relatively young man, probably still working as an industrialist, and in the image on the right, closer to his retirement. He actually became the director of the board of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 1903 and served in that capacity until his death in 1913. So Morgan, given the association with the bank, is probably most famous as a financier, a member of what some people might refer to as the robber barons, a moment in American history when there was a tremendous amount of wealth concentrated in very few hands, not so different perhaps from the situation that we have now, but nevertheless in a day before the income tax. So Morgan was actually a very committed philanthropist as well as an art collector. And I'm showing you here just an image that was taken by a photographer. Morgan actually didn't like to have his picture taken, so there aren't that many official photographs that survive, but this is one taken by a photographer whose name was Edward Steichen, who was in his 20s when Morgan sat for this portrait. And just to give you some sense of the intensity of Morgan as an individual, Edward Steichen mentioned that looking into Morgan's eyes was like trying to stare down a freight train. So Morgan was incredibly ambitious, very committed, and at the same time, very well traveled and certainly an avid consumer of history and of art as a collector. His reputation as a collector was so well established by 1901 when this cartoon was done that this illustrator in Puck magazine really, singles Morgan out as the collector who's hoovering up a broad range of material spanning the globe from ancient Egypt all the way up through medieval and Renaissance material. So the range of material that he was interested in was incredibly broad, but he did have a special affinity for medieval objects. And it's for that reason alone that the Met has such a strong collection of medieval art. One of the remarkable things about Morgan is that a lot of the objects that he collected were collected as single works of art, and you'll see some of those, but some of them were also collected as part of his broader effort to amass collections that had already been built. So by the time Morgan died in 1913, he had amassed such a vast collection that he actually himself had never seen it in one place. His collections were dispersed between New York. Eventually, he created the Morgan Library, which is where his holdings of illuminated manuscripts and a selection of medieval objects remain. There were gifts made after his death to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, made of medieval art, together with other kinds of objects. But he also provided objects that now you can find at the Wadsworth Athenaeum, for instance, in Hartford, Connecticut. He had 2 townhouses in London, which he used for the storage of his collections. And some of them were also on view at the Kensington Museum, which is the museum in London that we now know as the Victoria and Albert. Morgan's second wife, Frances Tracy Morgan, famously remarked that Morgan's appetite for art was such that he would buy anything from a pyramid to Mary Magdalene's tooth. And it might have been this very object that she was thinking about when she made that comment, because at the very core of this rock crystal, at the heart of this reliquary, a vessel made to hold a sacred relic, is a tooth that is identified by an inscription as the tooth of Mary Magdalene. This is one object that Morgan collected as a single piece. So that cartoon is fair in illustrating the ambition and scope of Morgan's focus, but maybe not so fair in making it seem as if he's kind of indiscriminately hoovering things up, although he was certainly amassing quite a collection. Morgan's major acquisitions of collections in terms of medieval art really started with the acquisition of a collection built and put together by an architect and designer in Paris, whose name was George Henschel, which he bought for $1.5 million. Morgan's purchase of the Henschel collection really created the core holdings of what we now know as the Met's medieval collection. And they went on view in New York in a wing at the Metropolitan Museum of Art that was purpose-built to house this collection. And this is an installation photograph from about 1910 showing this space with the Henschel collection installed in it. Those of you that know the Metropolitan Museum of Art might recognize this space because it still survives, although it's no longer installed in the way that you see it here. It's actually now used as the museum's galleries for arms and armor. But this is a wing referred to as Wing F that was created to receive the Henschel collection and put it on view, even before it was a gift to the museum. So when J.P. Morgan died, remarkably, he died without making specific provisions for where his collections would end up. And it was not until 1916, 1917 that his son, Jack Morgan, actually began the work of making gifts to institutions that his father had been deeply involved in. And the Met was one of the main beneficiaries of that great act of philanthropy. So one of the things I'd like to do with you now is just share a few of the objects that came in through J.P. Morgan. This is actually an object that was part of the Henschel collections originally. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about the ways in which I want to try and encourage you all to think and look at medieval art during this talk, and also when you have the opportunity in other places and times when you encounter it. This is a work of art that's known by the term Throne of Wisdom. Throne because Christ is actually sitting on the throne of his mother. So his mother is actually creating a throne that he is ensconced on, as you can see here. This was produced around the year 1175, 1200. And it is one of the moments in medieval art where three-dimensional sculpture begins to make a return. Believe it or not, there was a stretch of about 700 years after the fall of the Roman Empire when there was a deep ambivalence about three-dimensional imagery. Think about the 10 Commandments and the one commandment against idolatry. There's always been this strain within Christian art and theology that has been deeply ambivalent about the role of three-dimensional images in Christian worship. And you can think about episodes like the Reformation, for instance, where images in churches are destroyed by Protestants because of concerns about idolatry. And this is a tension that is certainly resurfacing when this object is made. But imagine that this is one of the first times you've actually seen a work of art featuring a holy figure like the Virgin Mary and the Christ child, for the first time rendered in three-dimensional space as opposed to a wall painting or a relief sculpture. How perhaps unsettling it might be. One of the ways in which the decision to produce objects like this was justified was that in this instance, this is not just a sculpture that would have been placed on an altar, but it also served as a container for relics that provided this object with a certain power and a certain connection back to the figures that it represented. The other thing I would mention here is the incredible surface detail that's been preserved on this work of art. A lot of wooden sculpture that survives from the Middle Ages, and even to a certain extent stone sculpture, would have been brightly painted. And this is one instance, a rare example, where a lot of the original polychromy, the colored paint, has survived on the surface of the object, providing a sense of relief detail. This is actually pressed tin underneath my cursor, and then you can see the carvings that articulate the shapes of the garment and the folds as they move around the body of the Christ child and his mother. In this back view, you get a sense of the wonderful kind of solid symmetry, the kind of eternal presence, if you will, that this object seems to resonate. And in the very upper left shoulder of the back of the object, you can see that there's a little chamber. This is actually the chamber that was carved out of the sculpture when the relics were placed inside at the time of its making. And we know that there are still relics in there because this has been put through medical imaging technology that allows us to see the contents of the object. So one of the aspects of this work that people often ask about is why, if this is intended to be the infant Jesus sitting on the lap of Mary, why does he look so adult? Well, one of the things that you have to keep in mind here is that the artist who's carving this is also trying to communicate a theological concept, and that is the notion of holy wisdom, that Christ is incarnated with the wisdom of the world, and so he's not just any child, but a very special child, and that sense of wisdom incarnate is probably best communicated by transforming him into a kind of man-child. Not to be disrespectful, but I think that is one way in which the medieval artist who produced this is navigating that artistic challenge. The other thing I would point out is that medieval art is often meant to be interactive. In this instance, I want to just call your attention to the detail of the carving of the ear of the Christ child. The idea here is that this is not just a sculpture, but a kind of a portal through which you can engage with the divine. And the reason for spending such time on articulating details like the ears is to make sure that it's understood that this sculpture is capable of listening, is capable of communicating prayers from worshipers to the divine figures that these sculptures represent. So I want you to come away with, if there's just a few things that you come away with thinking about medieval art in a general sense, is that medieval art was often meant to be highly interactive. This sculpture was wooden in part because it also would have moved during religious processions. It would have been brought out of the church and processed through the town that owned it, used on the high altar, called upon in times of need, in times of crisis, when the community that commissioned this object would have needed the help and assistance of the divine figures and the relics that were represented within the object. One of my favorite objects, also from Morgan's collection and the Henschel material, is this image of an ivory carved around the year 1115, 1120 in Spain. And it features episodes from the life of Christ after his resurrection. And I'm going to bring you down into this detail here of Mary Magdalene reaching out to touch the figure of Christ after his resurrection. According to the gospel narrative, Mary appears at the area where Christ's tomb is, She realizes that the tomb is now empty, and she sees a gardener nearby and asks if he knows where they have taken the body of her master and her Lord. And he looks up at her and says, "Mary, don't you recognize me? It is me." And she is disbelieving. And the only way that she can verify that she's looking at Christ is by reaching out to touch him. And he says, "Touch me not, noli me tangere," in Latin, "for I have not yet risen to my Father." So this moment of touch, this kind of interaction between these two figures, is powerfully communicated in this abstract figural language, where Mary is reaching out, her hands are almost fully cut from the ivory surface, so almost totally in the round, and then Christ pushing back the other way, that space between their outstretched hands, almost like that pregnant space between the hand of Adam and God in the Sistine Chapel. So medieval art also is tremendously involved in storytelling. Imagine that for many people who would have encountered objects like this, although a large numbers of them in a religious community would be literate, monks, ecclesiastics, priests, etc. Many people, like pilgrims who might have encountered things like this, probably couldn't read the gospel narrative in Latin. And so works of art were one of the primary carriers of that visual language. So medieval art, not only interactive, but also fundamentally engaged with telling stories. If you visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art at Met Fifth Avenue, one of the things that you'll note immediately is that the breadth of the collections are quite broad, both in terms of geography and in terms of chronology. The Eastern Roman Empire, which we now know as the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, features very prominently in this story. I'm showing you these galleries as they were installed for Heavenly Bodies, an exhibition that we did a couple of years ago. But these galleries frame either side of the grand staircase in the museum and provide the point of entry to the Western medieval galleries. And along the way, you'll encounter this great silver plate, which features the story of David and Goliath. This is part of the Second Cyprus treasure and a group of objects that Morgan bought and subsequently were gifted to the museum. And they're really the heart and in many ways one of the key pieces in the Byzantine side of the medieval collections at the Met. And to take you through the narrative, one of the things I just want to mention is that silver plate like this often bears stamps on the back that allow us to date them precisely. And we know that this was made probably during the reign of Heraclius, who was the Byzantine emperor who retook Jerusalem after the conquest of Jerusalem by the Sasanian Empire. So this is the lands of Persia to the east, which was one of the great rivals of the Byzantine Empire during this period. And in this instance, the Byzantines are really kind of shaping themselves as the inheritors of the concept of the chosen people, the Israelites, and doing battle with the Philistines, this great rival empire. But the language that's being spoken here is really a language that comes out of a Greco-Roman tradition. So although the subject matter is based in the Hebrew Bible, the visual language that the artist is speaking is coming out of the heritage of Rome and Greece, and specifically this kind of naturalistic vocabulary. Here at the very top of the plate, you can see the young David, the hand of God coming out to signal that God is in favor of the Israelites. And then that classical river god, which represents the river that separates the two armies, with Goliath, the champion of the Philistines, standing on the right. And then the kind of high point of the battle, swirling drapery, you can imagine the wind blowing on the battlefield with the giant Goliath advancing against David, who defends himself with the sling. You can just see in his lower right hand, and the outcome of the story many of us know. Goliath falls victim to the young David, who cuts off the head of the champion, and the Israelites triumph over the Philistines. This, as I said, is probably being used as an allegory for the reconquest of Jerusalem by the Byzantine emperor, who's picturing himself as acting in the tradition of David, the leader of the chosen people. So in medieval art, you'll often see artists drawing not only on sacred texts from the four Gospels, but also from the Hebrew Bible. And that's one of the things I just wanted to stress here. Morgan loved precious small things as well, and these enamels represent some of that category of object. The Byzantine Empire was famous for its enamel production. You're looking here at an object that's probably just a little bit smaller in life than it is on your computer screen. And this would have been hammered out of a sheet of gold, and the back would have been worked to receive the enamel that gives the color to the object. And every one of those lines that you see inside the outlines of the figure of Mary represents a piece of gold wire that has been soldered to the metal foundation. Here you can actually see the back of this enamel so that you get the sense of how the back is punched out. The line decoration is drawn using these little prick marks, and then on top of that is applied the gold wires that would serve as the boundaries between the color areas, as well as the lines that might define the folds of the garment that Mary is wearing. So Morgan loved this kind of material and definitely had an eye for quality. Now, thinking about the second site, there is a very different history to the cloisters, which has to do also with a great philanthropist, an industrialist of a slightly later moment, and that is John D. Rockefeller Jr. But it was actually George Gray Barnard, who was an American sculptor, who we can thank for the formation of the core collections. He was trained in the studio of Rodin and active at the very beginning of the sort of the tail end of the 19th, the early part of the 20th century. And George Gray Barnard supplemented his own income by collecting medieval art in the countryside in France and Spain just before the First World War. While he was doing this, this is the second thread in the story, John D. Rockefeller Jr. here in New York was spending a tremendous amount of time up in northern Manhattan, an area that was just beginning to be developed at the time. This is a place where he went horseback riding, and he was deeply interested in this place for the rather unique natural topography of the site, as well as for its connection to the Revolutionary War history of New York. This is where the kind of last defense of Manhattan happened after Manhattan and New York was abandoned by the colonials. Here you get a sense of what this area, which is now the cloisters, looked like when John D. Rockefeller Jr. began to buy up plots of land in this area, thinking that it needed to be protected. The subway was just beginning to reach this area at this moment. And here you get a sense of the approach of the subway. Broadway is just actually off the picture to the south here at the bottom. And then Barnard, who had amassed this collection of medieval art, actually relocated that collection to a private museum, which he called the Cloisters, which he founded in this area. And I'm going to show you highlighted a view of the original site of the Cloisters that Barnard created to showcase the work of medieval artists as a way of inspiring his own contemporaries with what he described as the achievements of the patient Gothic chisel. In 1925, Barnard approached the Met, and after a long series of negotiations, the Met actually purchased the Barnard Cloisters and began operating the Cloisters as a branch museum of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, devoted to the art and architecture of the Middle Ages. This gives you a sense of what that installation of Barnard's looked like when the Met took over the property and began to reshape it as an institutional museum rather than a private museum. Barnard was very much a romantic. He often piped in choir music, and sometimes even the security staff that he used would actually have monk's cowls on to enhance that sense of transporting you in time and place to another moment. When the Met opened and began to operate the Cloisters, it did so by adding a garden. And here you get the sense of the Met kind of reframing and repositioning the Cloisters. But what really changed the Cloisters was the decision to rebuild the museum as a purpose-built museum modeled on medieval architecture, so emulating and incorporating medieval architecture into its design to create a space that was empathetic to housing the collections that would be stored there. So the collections actually were moved about 1.5 miles to the north at the same time that Rockefeller finished his purchases of the land that would become Fort Tryon Park. So here you get a sense of the kinds of inspiration that the architect Collins, who is the same architect as Riverside Church here in New York, was looking to when he designed the building itself. This shot, it dates from about 1923. The museum opened to the public in 1938 and began operating as the cloisters that we now know from that time forward. So this is an image of the cloisters at the time of its opening in this new site. And those of you that has been here, this is probably the view that you might be more familiar with as the park has matured. The park itself was designed by Olmsted, the landscaping design firm that also was responsible for Central Park and Prospect Park here in New York. And the idea really is to transport people in time and place. Imagine in the 1930s that most people who had the opportunity to go to Europe, it was still a 2-week steamship journey to get there. So that sense in which the cloisters kind of gives you the idea of what it feels like to stand in a building that might be older than any building you might have direct experience of if you haven't had the chance to visit Europe, was definitely one of the sources of inspiration when it was first created with the help of Rockefeller's philanthropy. The other element is the gardens, and the gardens are a central feature of the experience of the building. So I'm going to share 3 works of art, and realizing that we're at about 40 minutes now. What I would like to do is just to give you a sense of how individual objects can open up ways of thinking about the Middle Ages and share with you some personal favorites. One of those objects is actually here at the cloisters, and it's in an area called the Treasury, which is devoted to small precious objects, many of which were created for ecclesiastical and religious reasons, but not all of them, and this is one case in point. The image that you're looking at is of a siege with defenders manning the battlements and people attacking, as you can see, in full armor. And we're going to come back and take a little bit of a closer look to what's actually going on. But first, the material. The material is ivory. You can sense that as you flip over the object, we're now looking at the back. There was probably a polished silver piece of metal inside the back of the object. So this would have served as a mirror, with this imagery of the siege on the other side. Ivory from elephants is quite unique with respect to ivory that comes from other materials. I'm showing you 2 cross sections, an elephant tusk on the left and a walrus tusk on the right. You can see how much material there is to work with if you're an artist using elephant ivory. And in the Middle Ages, especially in the 13th and 14th centuries, there was a tremendous surge in trade and interaction across the Mediterranean, sparked in part by the Crusades, but also driven by commerce and movement of peoples for pilgrimage and other purposes. And ivory really began coming into Western Europe in large numbers in the 13th century and into the 14th century. So you see it becoming a much more readily available material. And imagine that even in 1255, there was an elephant who lived at the Tower of London that was a gift from Louis IX, the French king, to the English king. It lived only for about 1.5 years, but it lived long enough for a monk to travel from St. Albans to paint this portrait of the elephant and his keeper when they were living in the royal menagerie that was part of the Tower of London. So imagine not just live elephants, that probably would have happened infrequently traveling the Mediterranean, but large numbers of ivory tusks as part of a broader network of trade, crisscrossing the Mediterranean in boats that looked a little bit like this, but in a modern recreation, these vessels were cogs, single-masted vessels often with steep sides and a flat bottom that made them easy to load, carry cargo. Their high walls made them defensible against pirates, but also the shallow draft would allow them to travel up rivers and help in moving cargo around the Mediterranean and up rivers like the Seine, eventually to places like Paris, where the ivory that we'll be looking at was made. The amazing thing is that this trade was not one directional. So although ivory was entering Western Europe from the continent of Africa across the Sahara, we also now know that copper was probably being provided to Africa from mines in places like France and Germany. We know that based on very recent research. This is actually an example of a copper object produced in what's now Nigeria in the 13th or 14th century. And scientific analysis of the materials has revealed that the copper that's being used to produce this bronze actually came from France. So we want to imagine a moment where these two areas of the world are linked together in a global network. And that's one of the reasons that you have the spread of epidemic happening in the way it does, like when we think about the Black Death. But ivory arrived in Europe in this form as tusks. And those tusks could provide a tremendous amount of material if you thought creatively about how to use it. So you think about a single large elephant tusk. It's solid ivory from about halfway through the tusk to the point where the end of the point is. And then as it gets to the elephant's mouth, you actually have soft tissue in here. But you can use that area to create an oliphant, a horn, and then you can use the solid material either to cut through it in sections, as we will be looking at, or in sheets where you can create surfaces that will serve as boxes. This object obviously is a cross section, and I'm going to return to it because it's interesting to take a closer look at what's actually happening. At the very top of this castle is one of the defenders who is singled out because he has wings and a bow and arrow. So if you think about wings and a bow and arrow, you can probably put those things together. This is actually the figure of Cupid, the god of love, who lived also during the Middle Ages in people's imagination. And if you look more carefully at this figure and those around him, you'll notice that all of the figures in the castle are actually women, and the attackers of the castle, some of whom have already gotten into the defenses, are men. So the subject that we're looking at is actually coming out of courtly love literature, so a vernacular tradition that emerges at this time that features the episode that's known as the Assault of the Castle of Love. You can see here the women sallying out from the portcullis, which has been raised. Instead of lances in their hands, they have tree boughs. They're pouring down not things of hot oil, but baskets of flowers to shower their attackers. And this is exactly the kind of object that might have belonged to someone like Bonne of Luxembourg, who on the one hand led a devotional life, a life of private prayer, attendance of religious services, but also a life of human experience in other realms. And these are the kinds of objects that can provide us with a real insight into the kinds of secular works of art that would have been cherished objects during the medieval period, but also objects that open up ways of thinking about trade, materials, technology that can provide different ways of thinking about the time period that we think about as the Middle Ages. I'm going to end with this painting, which is a signature work of art in the collections. And I'll get to it in a moment, but I just want to locate us in time. So we were just in Paris. Now we're moving north to the Low Countries, to the city of Tournai, which was a center for painting in this time period. And one of the standout works of art in the Cloisters collections is this picture, which is known as the Merode Altarpiece, after one of the families that owned it in its later history. But I want you to try to imagine this as an object that stands at the threshold of the modern era, where the paradigm that we now think about in painting, where the frame of the picture actually serves as a window that opens up into a world that's a visible extension of our own, just begins. To give you some sense of what this might feel like to look at through fresh eyes, not as an old master painting, but as a painting that was at the cutting edge of its own time, a kind of a work of contemporary art, if you will, from about 1430. You want to look at things like this. This picture was made around the year 1400, so from the same generation as the painting that we're looking at. It's one of the early examples we have of oil paint being used as a medium, as opposed to tempera, which is a egg-based painting technique. So it is connected to the Merode Altarpiece in that the Merode is really a tremendous innovation in that it uses oil paint to an even more impressive degree. But here, one of the things I just want to highlight is that the world that we're looking into is not necessarily a visible extension of our own. This is meant to be a kind of otherworldly view into a scene from sacred history, the Annunciation, where that gold backdrop creates this kind of otherworldly atmosphere. Imagine the resplendent character of that gold when you think about it, and it's the reflections in candlelight that its reflective surfaces would have created. This is something completely different. So think about this when imagine yourself being generally accustomed to seeing gold ground pictures, how innovative it must have looked to encounter a picture like this. This also represents a way of bringing sacred past, an episode from the Gospels, forcibly and vividly into the present of our own devotional experience, if we're thinking about patrons in the 1430s, because it's set within an interior that would have been a recognizable domestic space. You can see all the details of this domestic space rendered with an attention to surface, to the play of light, these views that open up through the windows into a clouded landscape, and the fact that we're given these very carefully studied views of objects that would have been the objects that these patrons, the upper class, in this case a merchant class of society, would have been probably collecting and maybe even trading. This is an example of a ceramic jar from Italy that would have been produced and traded at the time. And you can see, looking at this one real example and the painted example, how attentive the artists who were responsible for making this, Robert Campan and probably the young Jan van Eyck, were in crafting these details with an attention to surface. The interesting thing about this painting is that it's been subjected to technical analysis, and using X-radiograph imaging technology, we've been able to discover that it was painted probably in two different campaigns. The first campaign was the central panel, which gave us the scene of the Annunciation, this privileged view that we have into this domestic space where Gabriel in light blue or white is arriving to announce momentarily that Mary is about to become pregnant with Jesus, with the infant Jesus. And then the wings probably were special commissions by the donor, so a way of customizing the altarpiece to his needs and ownership. His name was Peter Engelbrecht, and when he first commissioned the painting, he was not yet married. So the interesting thing about the picture is that the second figure, his wife, was added in a second campaign after the initial painting was completed. So it's probably likely that Engelbrecht commissioned the picture, had himself added with this donor portrait and that additional panel, and then once the marriage was finalized, had his wife added. And what better picture to be looking at as a young couple hoping perhaps for their first child than the Annunciation, this episode from Christian history. So there's obviously a personal level on which this worked, but there's also a symbolic level on which this painting operated. And that is that the deeper you look and the more you look at this picture through the lens of theological literature, theology, episodes like this where Joseph, as a workman more so than a carpenter, more like a craftsman, is actually at work making mousetraps. And there is a reference in St. Augustine to the devil's mousetrap, the cross serving as the devil's mousetrap. So it's very likely that there were these kind of meditational prompts throughout the painting that would have been understood by the audience that was looking at it at the time. The whole space at the cloisters in which this painting is presented is designed to bring out the verisimilitude, the kind of the very real way in which these objects were created, the level of detail, the attention to real objects. So many of the objects that we display in this space are done in order to bring out that kind of vivid, true to life way in which the artists are really reaching back into biblical history, but bringing it, stretching it forward into the lived experience of the patrons who would have used this in their daily devotion. Something like this might have been in a domestic space rather than a church space or a family chapel. Now, I'm aware that we are at 5 minutes to 7, so I am going to stop here. I've got a few more slides, but I think rather than plow ahead, I will stop sharing my presentation and open the floor to questions, and thank everyone for their attention and their interest in this topic. Thank you very much.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, Tracy.
You can hear me, okay. I don't know if anyone can see me yet because I had this thing, oh, here we go. Hi. Fascinating talk, loved it. It made me very, I wanted to just get out of a plane and go to New York right now, go see everything again, because you really made the objects come to life in a new way. So thank you so much, Dr. Mann, it was great. And I also want to thank once more Dr. Alan Klein and the Sheppy Dog Fund Lecture for making this possible. So I really appreciate that. So as you mentioned, we have time for questions. Some people have already been submitting them, but go ahead and keep submitting as we're talking. So I'm going to go back to the first question that we got, and that was going all the way back to the Bonne manuscript with the 2 pages, the 3 living and the 3 dead.
Yeah.
And the question is, what was the prevailing view of the afterlife at the time of the plague?
Well, I mean, the prevailing view was for Christians that there would be was actually changing, so that there were so for someone like Bonne, she actually would have had an endowment that ensured that there were monks praying for her soul after her death, and that would allow her to kind of survive purgatory and go on to live in heaven. So there was, I mean, a firm belief in an afterlife. This is a moment where purgatory as a concept is just beginning to emerge. You can think about someone like Dante writing about purgatory within the context of Italian literature. But within, for someone like Bonne, who was a devout Christian, there would have been a firm belief in an afterlife. And there would have been ways of ensuring that you were remembered in the prayers of the living, whether it was, if you were wealthy, you might endow a chapel where monks or nuns would pray in perpetuity for your soul. Or if you were someone not of that same social strata, there were ways of leaving gifts that would ensure that that your soul was cared for. But this was a moment where there was a powerful belief in an afterlife, and that's this whole notion of patronage, individuals who are commissioning works of art or creating buildings. A lot of that is as a result of the desire to give these as gifts to the church and to ensure the salvation of one's soul as a result.
Thank you. And I forgot to say that who I am. I just jumped in here. But I'm Tracy Glavin. I'm the curator at the Flint Institute of Art. And a couple of other housekeeping notes. This is being recorded. So if you jumped in at any time or you want to share with anyone, we are going to have it posted on our website, flintarts.org. So just wanted to get that out there before we ask more questions. And also a fun thing I want to share with the audience that they might not know, because your bookshelf behind you doesn't really tell where you are, but why don't you tell us where you are right now?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'm actually speaking to you from the tower at the Cloisters. So in that first slide, you saw the bell tower, and I'm on the 5th floor of the bell tower right now. So broadcasting from the Cloisters as we speak.
Which I think is super cool. So I just wanted everybody else to know that information. So another question that we received, actually it came in a few days ago through email, and you sort of hit on this several times by saying this is one of your favorites, but this person asked, there are so many wonderful objects on display at the Cloisters. Can you pick one object that will always draw your eye to linger on it as you walk through the building? And she said her personal vote is the unicorn cat.
Oh, yeah. Well, actually, that was the next set of slides I have queued up, but I just thought in the interest of time, I would save that for another venue. But I mean, if you think about the Cloisters, there are probably 2 or 3 works of art that are internationally known by those people that are enthusiasts of museums and medieval art more specifically. One is certainly the unicorn tapestries. The second is the Merode Altarpiece, which I shared with you tonight. The third might be what's known as the Cloisters Cross, which was made famous in part by a publication called King of the Confessors that Thomas Hoving wrote after being director of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And a personal favorite, frankly, is the Assault of the Castle of Love, the ivory that I shared with you, because I feel like it opens up so many different windows into the Middle Ages, and it's also an aspect of medieval artistic practice that we don't see as much of, because the secular side of the medieval world, not to say that there was this concept of a difference between secular and sacred in that time period, but objects that were used in kind of the day-to-day experience of people's lives, even for the upper classes, don't survive as often because, if they were precious metals, they would sometimes be melted down and transformed into other objects as fashions changed or cash was needed. But certainly for me, the unicorn, maraude, and right now the ivory mirrorback.
Very cool. So some of the other questions that have to deal with technical issues, and since you mentioned the ivory piece, one person asked, would they have been taken from live animals, or would they have been slaughtered animals, the ivory?
Yeah, to be blunt about it, I think that much of the ivory that would have been used during the Middle Ages would have been harvested from, by killing elephants. There were obviously a lot more elephants at that time than there are now. There are a lot of necessary, in my mind, restrictions around the sale and circulation of ivory now. But during the Middle Ages, there were moments when ivory was used as a material that was surprisingly available, the 13th and 14th centuries being one of those moments, and the 10th and 11th centuries being another. Those are moments of tremendous cross-Mediterranean activity and trade. But there are also moments of shortage of ivory in the Middle Ages, and in some cases in our collections, we actually have examples of late antique ivory, so ivory that was probably harvested and carved in the 5th century that was then reused in the 10th century when ivory was a bit more scarce. So yes, I think a lot of the ivory tusks that would have been coming into Europe would have been harvested from, by hunting live animals and bringing that ivory across. This was mostly savannah elephant ivory that would have been brought across the trans-Saharan trade routes and also up and down the east coast of Africa, what's sometimes referred to as the Swahili coast, so the Red Sea trade routes.
Another question related to materials is about the actual cloisters themselves. Someone writes that they believe that the cloisters were made from stone from a cloister in Europe, several cloisters, which were repurposed. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there are elements of real medieval buildings that have been incorporated into the cloisters. The building itself as a structure is a modern creation, looking at medieval sources of inspiration. But throughout the building, you will actually encounter physical elements of medieval building that have been incorporated into the structure as it now stands. Most of the exterior stone of the cloisters actually was quarried in the area around New London, Connecticut. But when you get into the interior spaces of the museum and the cloisters themselves, there are kind of 4 signature spaces. Those are medieval building elements, and the one central space, which is known as Cusha Cloister, that stone, even though some of the stone was added when the cloisters was built, the stone itself was quarried from the same site that the medieval artists who built the Cusha Cloister at Saint Michel de Cusha quarried their red marble stone. The quarries were actually reopened when the cloisters was built here in New York.
And many of those places where it came from, they were already in ruins or had.
Yeah, in the wake of the French Revolution, a lot of these monastic houses became state property and were essentially disbanded. Sometimes the property was sold off. So in the case of Cusha Cloister, which is our largest cloister, in many ways the signature cloister here at the museum, a lot of those elements that Barnard himself purchased were actually already on a local estate in a kind of swimming pool area. And he negotiated their purchase from that owner and then brought them here to New York. That kind of thing wouldn't happen now. But in fact, the French government changed its laws about cultural patrimony, in part in response to George Gray Barnard having removed so much material just before the outbreak of the First World War in 1914.
Very interesting. So a lot more questions are and I'm going to try to group a few since they're related to each other. One person wanted to know how many pieces are in the collection, and are you continuing to acquire pieces?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I mean, the Met is probably one of the bigger collections of medieval art in the world when it comes to museums, and certainly in this country. There are about 10,000 works of art at the Met, divided between two locations, the Met Fifth Avenue buildings, where the collections stretch from late antiquity, so the fall of the Roman Empire, and encompass the Eastern Mediterranean as well as the Western European world. Whereas at the Cloisters, the collections here are probably about 3,000 in number and are really focused and concentrated on Western European Middle Ages from about the time of Charlemagne, so the 9th century, up through the 16th century, the cusp of what we would think about as the Renaissance.
And going back to the Campen altarpiece, there's a couple of questions about that, so I'm going to ask them both at the same time. First, someone asked what pigments were used for the blue and red in the altarpiece, and then the other one was, why is there a missing candle? There's only one candle and the two holders by the fireplace.
Yeah. So the pigments are actually often mineral based. Blue is typically, especially for a commission like this, something like lapis lazuli, which surprisingly would have been quarried in Afghanistan, what's now Afghanistan, and was prized for the quality and the durability of the blue that it provided. So it's a mineral based pigment. The red sometimes was mollusk shell. Purple typically was mollusk shell and quite difficult to produce, so also quite expensive. There were also, you think about something like burnt sienna. There were, also naturally occurring materials that would have been used for other kinds of colors as well. And then the binder is oil based, so usually something like linseed oil. And the candle, so there is a candle on the table which is extinguished with the arrival of Gabriel. The kind of divine wind of his arrival blows out that candle. And then there are the empty candlesticks that you can see up on either side of the fire mantle. The one candle that is most often read symbolically is the one on the table, which is the single candle that's been extinguished. And the idea there is that the arrival of Gabriel ushers in the New Testament, and that is a moment of transition from Judaism to Christianity, and that it's the kind of extinguishing of the Old Testament and the arrival of the New is the way that that a lot of scholars have interpreted that particular detail.
Great. So this is changing subject for a second, but Margaret Kelly writes, one of my favorite objects in the medieval section of the Met is the tiny bed of baby Jesus. Can you talk about this object a little bit?
Yeah, there is a crib, which is here at the Met with embroidered textile decoration. Well, I mean, picture a small crib. I mean, it's a crib that's the size of a doll. And in fact, that's what it would have been used for. It probably comes from a community of female religious who didn't take vows. So they were not nuns, but they did charitable works. And they would have used things like that object as well as dolls, essentially, carved wooden sculptures of the baby Jesus in their devotions as ways of kind of more deeply involving in their prayers that sense of kind of meditative, the way of transporting you into a moment from the sacred past. So it's in fact in our galleries now at the main building at Fifth Avenue. We've just relocated it, but it still is on view. And it's an object that many people comment on. It is literally a miniature crib with embroidered cushions and a tremendous amount of textile decoration. It's an amazing survivor. I can only think of maybe half a dozen of those that have survived. But it probably came out of a female community, and they were focused on charitable works, especially on the care of the sick and the dying. They were known as beguines and created houses in what we now know as places like Belgium and the Netherlands.
So the next question is from Jan, and she said, or he or she says, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. The transition to the more internal realistic view that you showed seems very fast. What do you see as the critical point of change to that view?
You mean what's driving that change? I mean, it is, I mean, obviously it feels abrupt in my talk, and it's longer a process than I presented, but not that much longer. I think, you know, one of the things that the artists of the Merode Altarpiece, Campan and the young Jan van Eyck perhaps, are grappling with is the kind of evolving way of showing perspective. That same moment in Italy, you have someone like Leon Battista Alberti, and he's kind of theorizing one-point perspective, where you get these receding lines that take you to a distant point that really feel like you're looking into another space that feels a little less kind of tilted up than maybe the Merode Altarpiece was. So there's definitely an interest in optics, and there's a scientific side that I think is driving that. But there is also a very strong devotional component to that, and that is the in writings about prayer and devotion in that time period. There are lots of ways in which people are encouraged to use their own world as a point of entry to imagine this distant past and bring it closer. So I think that it's a complicated question, I think, and it's certainly less of a sharp turn than I presented tonight. But it is fascinating to think of a moment where the Merode Altarpiece is existing in the same world with those gold ground pictures, and that there are artists who are working in that mode at the same time, that this radical new way of re-envisioning the world is being developed.
Definitely. So you mentioned prayer books. Linda's asking about the text in the prayer books. She assumed that prayers in the Roman Catholic tradition at that time would have been in Latin, but she saw French in the slide showing the crucifix with the two kneeling figures.
Yeah, excellent spotting. I mean, the 13th century is a moment of significant change when it comes to prayer, devotional life, and even literature, where there is the beginnings of a rise of vernacular languages. Some of the earliest translations of the Bible into things like French and Italian date from the 13th century. You do have an upper class, someone like Bonne might have been literate in Latin, but also would have been literate, perhaps even more so, in vernacular languages like French. And that assault of the Castle of Love, which dates from just before the Black Death, probably from about 1330, 1340, is really coming out of a tradition that is almost exclusively vernacular. So this is a moment when you have a real change beginning to happen, and new audiences that are being addressed. I mean, you have people like Francis of Assisi, who is using French troubadour kind of literary traditions and repurposing those to create devotional, approaches to devotional texts. But the reason he's doing that is because he's trying to reach people in their own native tongue and evangelizing, if you will, to a whole new urban audience. This is also a moment where universities are being founded. The first faculties that study things like medicine are being created, and it's a moment of significant urbanization where you have an influx of people from the countryside around cities coming into places like Florence, Siena, Paris, London, and that's one of the reasons that the Black Death is so devastating to these populations, is because these cities were very tightly packed places at that moment.
Mm. Sandra asked about the gold enamel piece from the Treasury, and how many pieces are usually on view, and do you ever offer special tours?
Yeah, well, there are tours during normal times. We are not doing in-person events now, but I encourage people to visit the Met online, because there are always virtual offerings, much like what we're doing here. And they're sometimes short in format and sometimes more extended like this one. The enamel piece is actually on view in the Met Fifth Avenue building, and it's part of a series of works of art that we have on display in an area that we refer to as the Byzantine Apse. And at the Cloisters, there is also a treasury, which is where that ivory mirror back is on view. And we do offer and hope to offer, again, in-person tours of those objects on a regular basis, highlights tours essentially of the collection. But until that time, please visit us online if you don't have the chance to come in person.
And I'll second that with that you have some cool videos, including one showing how the chapel from Spain came over, or how it was dismantled and put back together. So there's a lot of fun things to do that way too.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, no problem. So Anna asked, how do the unicorn tapestries at the Met compare to the unicorn tapestries at the Clooney in Paris, as far as when they were made? Are they similar?
Right. So they're both part of the same era. The ones at the Musée Clooney might be a little bit earlier, but not much. We're only talking about a difference of maybe 15 to 20 years. They are unconnected to each other historically, but they have come to be known together just because they are very rare survivors. They both survive, not in pristine condition, but in as about a good condition as you can expect for textile material from the period. The Cloisters tapestries were made around the year 1500, and the Clooney tapestries maybe about 1490 or so. Sadly, right now, we were supposed to be hosting the Clooney tapestries here at the Cloisters, but we canceled that exhibition because of the epidemic that we're all living through right now. Mm-hmm. But that would have been one time that I'm aware of where those two sets of tapestries would have been brought together. They have come to be known together, as I say, and appear in Harry Potter films and other places in popular culture. But historically, they're not connected by commission. In fact, we don't actually know who commissioned the Cloisters tapestries. They are much more narrative because they really feature the hunt for the unicorn. So there is a kind of story that spools out across the various sets of 7 tapestries, whereas the Musée Clooney is more of an allegory. Those tapestries are devoted to the 5 senses.
Mm. Is the exhibition going to be rescheduled?
Sadly, no. We had to we were hoping it might be postponed, but the reason that it ended up being a cancellation is because the Musée Clooney is involved in construction work, and they were willing to lend the tapestries because they were going to be dark and closed while we had them here in New York. But now that the timeline has slipped, that's one of their central objects when you go to visit. So they will remain in Paris.
Bummer.
I know.
Chalk another one up to COVID. Yeah. Paul asked, was J.P. Morgan's interest in knowledge of art something that was part of his background, or did he develop it as his wealth grew?
No, I think it was part of his background. He was, so he's sort of the second generation of wealth. He's obviously he did a lot to accumulate the wealth that he built, but he was the son of a very wealthy man already, and he was educated in Europe. So he was quite well traveled even as a young man. He eventually built himself, or had built, a yacht called the Corsair, and would use that yacht to travel to places like Venice and eventually Egypt. He loved to go on excavations. He was a fairly active member of the Episcopal Church and very interested in the roots and the kind of early story of Christianity. That's something that he shared with other patrons of his generation. And that's one of the reasons that here at the Met, there were excavations not only in Pharaonic Egypt, so looking at the deep ancient history of Egypt, but also excavations in areas of Christian Egypt during the Ptolemaic period, so Egypt under Roman rule. But he had an interest in things like papyri fragments that would help him put together the puzzle of how the early texts of the 4 Gospels were generated and translated. So I think he really developed his interest in history and in art as a young man from an early stage.
From Mimi, she says that she's fascinated by the culture represented in medieval art, how it connects to current cultural and religious practices. Is this something that the Met conveys through educational programs?
Yeah, I mean, we certainly always try to make connections to the present day, and I think we also try to be very respectful that the material that we deal with is connecting to living traditions and faith practices. We have recently begun to acquire objects that speak to different faith traditions as well. So one of our most recent acquisitions is actually a Hebrew Bible that was produced in Spain in the 14th century. And, it's the case that earlier generations were less interested in that kind of material because there was an emphasis sort of, let's say on the Christian Middle Ages. But we are, I think, much more interested now in telling a broader story of the period. And we have been developing exhibitions and programs that address not only faith traditions like Christianity, but also Judaism. And we have an exhibition coming up that looks at the frontier between Christian and Muslim Spain that will be here at the Cloisters in the summer of 2021, so a little less than a year from now. And some of our exhibitions, we actually have people who are coming not only for an interest in art, but because of an interest in the religious traditions that are represented by those works of art.
That's great, and I know it's always a challenge to connect contemporary issues with something that seems so remote, but yet when you look at medieval art, you realize they have a lot more in common with us than we think.
Yeah, in many ways, these days, the Middle Ages has never felt closer.
Exactly. So we need to wrap up. So I just have a couple more comments and this is a question/comment. Anne-Marie mentions she visits annually Cologne and the Schnutken Museum, and was wondering if you're familiar with the collection and the Cologne School of Smiling Saints.
Yes, I am. The Schnutken is one of a few museums in the world that are devoted to the art and architecture of the Middle Ages, and in that case, they're actually installed in an old church. And Cologne was famous for what's called the beautiful style. So these kind of smiling angels and figures of the Virgin and Child. The other museums that focus on the medieval period would be in Paris, the Musée Clooney, and in Florence, the Bargello. And then finally in Vic in Spain, there is also a museum that focuses on the Middle Ages. So we are a kind of a small community of institutions that have a lot in common, and we lend objects to each other, and we share ideas about exhibitions, and sometimes even have visits from staff. So that it is you can imagine it's a small world.
How did you get interested in studying medieval art? What brought you to that place?
So I think for me, the answer would be childhood experience. On the one hand, I spent 7 years as a young child living in Ankara, Turkey, which I think provided an exposure to a deep sense of history that I probably wouldn't have gotten at the same stage in my life growing up here in the United States, just because it's all right there. These monuments that you can see and run around in. And then I think one of the things I mentioned at the very beginning is the kind of interactive nature of medieval art, that these are objects that were meant to be held, meant to be used in, whether it's religious ritual or in a lady's chamber in the case of, something like the mirror back. So there's a kind of functional dimension to medieval art. And the attention to materials and craftsmanship, I think, is something that I find very, very exciting. And the work that they're able to do to innovate and to kind of reinvent something, working within a context where there were definitely restrictions on the way in which art was used and thought about.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much. It wasn't a question, but I wanted to mention it as a comment. One of the comments from an attendee was how they appreciated your feminist introduction by starting with the Bonne manuscript, and how that really is important to understand that aspect. And for anyone who has not visited the Cloisters or the Met, I highly recommend it when travel is safe again, and it's well worth the cab ride or subway, very long subway haul to get to the Cloisters. It's so much fun. It's one of my favorite places in Manhattan. So
Thank you, Tracy. Well, it's certainly worth the pilgrimage, and you really don't believe you're in Manhattan when you step inside that first garden space. It's a pretty powerful experience.
It is. It's magical. And I'll end with Dr. Klein's comment to you. Thank you for a wonderful, enlightening presentation. Please keep in mind, we would like to invite you to Flint post-COVID to present again in person. So maybe the Unicorn Tapestries.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. And obviously the Unicorn Tapestries would certainly be top of mind for me in coming back. So thank you very much. And also thank you very much for your support of the Flint Institute of Art, and for all that you do to keep us connected to those stories of the past. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And have a good night, everyone.
All right. Best wishes to everyone out there.
Bye.